The rain hammered against the windows of Lincoln High School as Sarah Martinez clutched her lesson plans tighter, her knuckles white against the manila folder. She had no idea that in exactly 47 minutes, she would be face down in the mud behind the school gymnasium, surrounded by laughing teenagers with their phones out, recording her humiliation. But what those bullies didn't know, what nobody at Lincoln High knew, was that the quiet, soft-spoken English teacher had spent 4 years as a Navy SEAL, completing missions that would make grown men weep. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez had always been different, though no one at Lincoln High School would have guessed just how different. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose and cardigans that seemed to swallow her petite frame, she looked like she belonged in a library more than a battlefield. Her voice rarely rose above a whisper during faculty meetings, and she had a habit of apologizing for things that weren't her fault. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," she would say when contributing to discussions about curriculum changes, even though she had been specifically asked for her input. The other teachers had grown accustomed to her gentle demeanor, her tendency to fade into the background during social gatherings, and her preference for eating lunch alone in her classroom while grading papers. But Sarah carried secrets that ran deeper than the Pacific Ocean trenches she had once navigated during classified operations. 8 years ago, she had been Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, one of only a handful of women to successfully complete Navy SEAL training. The rigorous program that broke most candidates within the first week had forged her into something unbreakable. Though she had learned to hide that steel beneath layers of soft-spoken kindness, the transition from military service to civilian life had been jarring. After her honorable discharge, Sarah had deliberately chosen teaching as a way to heal from the violence she had witnessed and participated in during her service. She wanted to nurture young minds, to build rather than destroy, to create something meaningful in a world that had shown her too much darkness. The classroom became her sanctuary, a place where she could channel her protective instincts into something constructive. Lincoln High School was located in Millbrook, a small town in Oregon where everyone knew everyone, and newcomers were scrutinized with the intensity of a microscope. Sarah had moved there 3 years ago, drawn by the school's reputation for academic excellence and the promise of a quiet life away from the chaos of her military past. She had crafted a carefully constructed identity as a mild-mannered educator, complete with a fabricated backstory about growing up in a small town in Ohio and attending a quiet liberal arts college. The deception wasn't born from shame about her service, but from necessity. Sarah had learned that people treated her differently when they knew about her military background. Some became uncomfortable, others overly curious, and a few seemed to expect her to be someone she no longer wanted to be. The classroom allowed her to be gentle, nurturing, and vulnerable in ways that military life had never permitted. Her students initially tested her boundaries, as teenagers do with any new teacher. They would talk during lessons, ignore assignments, and push to see how far they could go before consequences arrived. But Sarah had developed a teaching style that was both firm and compassionate, earning respect through patience rather than intimidation. She learned their names on the first day, remembered details about their lives, and created an environment where even the most reluctant learners felt safe to participate. The problems began with Marcus Wheeler, a senior who had been held back twice and seemed to view high school as his personal kingdom. At 18, he was larger than most of his classmates, with the kind of natural athletic ability that had made him a star on the football team, until grades and attitude problems got him kicked off. Marcus had a following of younger students who orbited around him like planets around a dying star, drawn to his rebellious energy and intimidated by his willingness to cross lines that others wouldn't dare approach. Marcus had initially tested Sarah like he did all his teachers, But when his usual tactics failed to provoke the explosive reactions he craved, his attention became more focused and malicious. He began to see her quiet nature not as strength, but as weakness to be exploited. Her kindness became a target. Her gentle corrections a challenge to his authority among his peers. The escalation had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first. Marcus would arrive to class a few minutes late, disrupting the lesson with elaborate apologies that were clearly performed for his friend's amusement. He would ask inappropriate questions designed to make Sarah uncomfortable, then feign innocence. When she redirected the conversation, his homework assignments became increasingly creative exercises in pushing boundaries, with essays that contained just enough inappropriate content to be problematic without being overtly offensive. Sarah had dealt with difficult students before, but Marcus was different. He had an intuitive understanding of psychological warfare, an ability to find pressure points and apply just enough force to create discomfort without triggering formal disciplinary action. He seemed to sense that beneath her calm exterior lay something that could be provoked, and he was determined to find it. The other teachers had noticed the dynamic, but offered little support beyond sympathetic looks and vague suggestions about establishing authority. The administration, led by Principal Janet Harrison, a woman who had been running Lincoln High for nearly 2 decades, seemed more concerned with avoiding conflict than addressing it. When Sarah had attempted to discuss Marcus's behavior during a faculty meeting, she was told that boys will be boys, and that perhaps she needed to find her voice as an educator. Sarah's military training had taught her to assess threats and respond appropriately. But the rules of engagement in a high school classroom were vastly different from those in a combat zone. She couldn't simply neutralize Marcus Wheeler the way she would have handled a hostile insurgent. Instead, she had to navigate the complex social dynamics of teenage hierarchies, administrative politics, and small-town sensibilities while maintaining her carefully constructed civilian persona. The situation reached a new level of intensity when Marcus began recruiting other students to his cause. Tyler Brooks, a junior with a reputation for cruelty disguised as humor, became Marcus's lieutenant in what seemed to be a systematic campaign to break Sarah's spirit. Together, they orchestrated a series of increasingly elaborate pranks and disruptions that tested the limits of what could be dismissed as harmless teenage mischief. They would coordinate their bathroom breaks to ensure maximum disruption, stage whispered conversations during lessons that were just loud enough to be distracting, and create an atmosphere of barely contained chaos that made learning impossible for the other students. Sarah found herself spending more time on classroom management than actual teaching, her carefully planned lessons derailed by the need to address constant behavioral issues. The psychological pressure was beginning to show. Sarah found herself lying awake at night, replaying classroom interactions and wondering if she had made the right choice in leaving military service. The skills that had once made her formidable in combat zones seemed useless against the subtle warfare of high school politics. She had faced down armed enemies in foreign countries, but a group of teenagers was slowly eroding her confidence in ways that bullets and bombs never could. Her fellow teachers began to whisper about her control issues, and she could feel their sympathy transforming into judgment. The same colleagues who had once praised her innovative teaching methods now exchanged glances when she entered the faculty lounge, their conversations dying to uncomfortable silence when she approached. Sarah realized that in their eyes, she was beginning to be seen as the problem rather than the victim of systematic harassment. The breaking point was approaching, though Sarah didn't yet realize it. Marcus Wheeler had been testing her defenses for months, probing for weaknesses like a predator circling wounded prey. He had identified her desire to avoid conflict as a vulnerability and was preparing to exploit it in ways that would force her to choose between maintaining her peaceful facade and defending herself with skills that belonged to a different life entirely. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths that Sarah had worked years to keep hidden and transform a quiet English classroom into a battlefield where the rules of engagement were about to change forever. The October morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep through the walls of Lincoln High School. Sarah Martinez stood before her bathroom mirror at home, practicing the breathing technique she had learned during SEER training: survival, evasion, resistance, escape. She hadn't needed these calming methods in years, but the knot in her stomach told her that today would test every ounce of self-control she possessed. The previous week had brought a new player into Marcus Wheeler's orbit: Jessica Hartley, a popular junior whose social media influence extended far beyond the school's brick walls. Jessica had cultivated an image as the school's unofficial queen bee, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a wardrobe that somehow managed to push dress code boundaries without ever quite crossing them. Her addition to Marcus's campaign against Sarah represented a dangerous escalation where Marcus relied on brute intimidation. Jessica specialized in social destruction. Jessica's weapon of choice was her phone, specifically the camera that never seemed to leave her manicured fingers. She had begun documenting what she called Ms. Martinez's meltdowns for her social media followers, though these supposed breakdowns were actually moments when Sarah had simply asked students to follow basic classroom rules. The videos were edited with surgical precision, removing context to make Sarah appear unreasonable, weak, or incompetent. "Can you believe this?" Jessica had whispered loudly enough for the entire class to hear during Tuesday's lesson on symbolism in literature. "She's literally shaking because I asked to borrow a pencil." The comment wasn't true. Sarah had been reaching for her water bottle, but Jessica's followers erupted in barely suppressed laughter, and the sound was captured perfectly by the hidden recording device. The social media assault had begun innocuously enough. Jessica posted short clips with captions like, "When your teacher can't handle simple questions," and "Some people aren't cut out for teaching." The posts gained traction among Lincoln High students, then spread to other schools in the district, and eventually caught the attention of regional social media accounts that specialized in viral educational content. Sarah discovered the extent of the online campaign when her neighbor, Mrs. Chun, mentioned seeing a video of her on Facebook. The realization that her professional reputation was being systematically destroyed by edited footage hit her like a physical blow. She spent that evening scrolling through comments from strangers who had formed opinions about her competence based on manipulated clips, each criticism feeling like a small knife wound. The psychological warfare intensified when Marcus and Tyler began coordinating with Jessica to create what they called content opportunities. They would engineer situations designed to provoke reactions that could be filmed and distorted. Marcus would make increasingly inappropriate comments during class discussions, while Tyler provided a running commentary that pushed boundaries without quite crossing into territory that would result in immediate suspension. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The trio had developed a sophisticated understanding of administrative blind spots. They knew that Principal Harrison preferred to avoid conflicts that might attract negative attention to the school, especially incidents that could be perceived as failures of teacher management. They also understood that Sarah's quiet nature made her an unlikely candidate to escalate situations to higher authorities, particularly when doing so might result in increased scrutiny of her teaching methods. Sarah found herself trapped in a psychological maze where every response seemed to lead to further humiliation. When she ignored the provocations, Marcus and his allies interpreted her silence as weakness and increased their pressure. When she attempted to address the behavior directly, Jessica's camera was ready to capture her overreactions for viral consumption. The normal tools of classroom management, parent conferences, administrative referrals, and detention assignments seemed powerless against students who had transformed disruption into a form of entertainment. The situation reached a new level of sophistication when the group began using technology to their advantage. Tyler, whose father worked in IT, had figured out how to connect his Bluetooth speaker to the classroom's audio system during Sarah's planning period. The next day, in the middle of her lesson on Shakespearean sonnets, the speaker suddenly blared. A recording of Sarah's voice saying, "I don't know how to control these kids anymore." A comment taken from a private conversation with another teacher and recorded without her knowledge. The incident created chaos that took 15 minutes to resolve, during which time Jessica's camera captured every moment of Sarah's confusion and frustration. The video, posted within hours, was viewed thousands of times and shared across multiple platforms, with captions questioning Sarah's competence and professionalism. The comments section became a forum for strangers to debate her fitness as an educator, with many suggesting she should find a different career. The psychological pressure began manifesting in physical symptoms that Sarah recognized from her military training as signs of prolonged stress exposure. Her sleep patterns became erratic, her appetite disappeared, and she found herself hypervigilant in ways that reminded her of patrol duty in hostile territories. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had survived combat zones in 3 different countries, but a group of American teenagers was triggering trauma responses she thought she had left behind. Sarah's carefully constructed civilian identity started showing cracks that threatened to expose the warrior lurking beneath. During a particularly aggressive confrontation, when Marcus had deliberately knocked her coffee cup to the floor and then suggested she was too clumsy to be around kids, Sarah's muscle memory kicked in. For a fraction of a second, her stance shifted into a combat posture, her hands moving instinctively to positions that could quickly transition to defensive or offensive capabilities. The moment passed unnoticed by the students, but Sarah recognized how close she had come to revealing skills that belonged to a different life. That evening, she called her former commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Reyes, now retired and living in Colorado. The conversation was brief but illuminating. "You can't fight a conventional war against guerrilla tactics," Colonel Reyes had said. "These kids have figured out asymmetrical warfare, and they're using your own rules against you. The question is, are you going to let them win by fighting on their terms, or are you going to change the game?" The colonel's words echoed in Sarah's mind as she prepared for what she sensed would be a crucial day. Marcus had been escalating his campaign systematically, each incident more brazen than the last. Yesterday, he had announced to the entire class that he was planning something epic for Friday afternoon, something that would finally show everyone what this teacher is really about. The challenge was clear, though the specifics remained unknown. Sarah understood that Marcus had painted himself into a corner where he needed to deliver a spectacular humiliation to maintain his status among his followers. Jessica's social media audience was expecting content. Tyler was ready to provide support, and the entire social ecosystem of Lincoln High School seemed primed for whatever confrontation was coming. Sarah spent Thursday evening in her garage, where she kept a small collection of equipment from her military days. She ran her fingers over gear she hadn't touched in years: tactical gloves, boots designed for rapid movement, and clothing that could withstand rough conditions. She wasn't planning to use any of it, but touching these remnants of her former self provided a strange comfort, a reminder of capabilities that still resided beneath her carefully cultivated exterior. The morning of the confrontation arrived, with the kind of gray, drizzling weather that seemed to match the mood permeating Lincoln High School. Students moved through the hallways with an electric anticipation, whispering about Marcus's planned show and speculating about what form it might take. Several teachers noticed the unusual energy but attributed it to typical Friday afternoon restlessness. Sarah entered her classroom with the measured calm that had once carried her through pre-mission briefings. She had made peace with the likelihood that her carefully maintained cover was about to be blown, that the quiet English teacher persona she had cultivated for 3 years might not survive the day. The only question remaining was whether she could navigate the coming storm without completely abandoning the gentle soul she had worked so hard to become. As her fifth period class filed in, Marcus, Jessica, Tyler, and their various allies taking their usual seats, Sarah noticed the phones were already positioned for optimal recording angles. The stage was set, the cameras were rolling, and somewhere in the next 45 minutes, everything was going to change. The fluorescent lights in room 214 seemed to hum with unusual intensity as Sarah Martinez began her fifth period American literature class. The rain that had been threatening all week finally arrived in earnest, drumming against the windows with increasing force. 23 students sat before her, but the energy in the room felt charged with the anticipation of spectators waiting for gladiators to enter the arena. Marcus Wheeler sat in his usual back corner seat, flanked by Tyler Brooks and a new recruit to their group, Danny Castellano, a sophomore who had recently transferred from a military academy after what his parents diplomatically called disciplinary issues. Danny's addition to the group had introduced a tactical sophistication that Sarah found disturbingly familiar. His movements were precise, his positioning deliberate, and his eyes held the calculating look of someone who understood strategy and patience. Jessica Hartley occupied her throne in the third row, her phone positioned at an angle that would capture both Sarah and Marcus in the same frame. She had spent the morning building anticipation on her social media accounts, posting cryptic messages about major drama coming to Lincoln High. Her follower count had grown to over 15,000 across various platforms, and the engagement on her teacher content had caught the attention of several viral video compilation accounts. Sarah began the lesson with her usual quiet confidence, discussing the themes of power and corruption in Arthur Miller's The Crucible. The irony of the subject matter wasn't lost on her. She was living through her own witch trial, where perception mattered more than truth, and mob mentality could destroy lives with manufactured evidence. The true test of character, Sarah said, writing on the whiteboard, comes not when we're comfortable, but when we're under pressure. How we respond to injustice reveals who we really are. Marcus smirked and whispered something to Tyler that made the boys snicker. The sound was calculated to be just loud enough to disrupt without being overtly disrespectful. Sarah had learned to recognize these microaggressions, the death by 1,000 cuts approach that the group had perfected. The first phase of their plan became evident when Danny raised his hand with an innocent expression. "Ms. Martinez, I'm having trouble understanding Proctor's character. Why doesn't he just fight back against the people accusing him? If someone was lying about me, I'd make them pay." The question was loaded with subtext that every student in the room understood. Sarah recognized the tactical probing. Danny was testing her responses, looking for weak points in her emotional armor. His military academy background was showing in the way he framed the challenge. "Proctor faces a complex situation," Sarah replied, maintaining her calm demeanor. "Sometimes the right response isn't the obvious one. Real strength often means choosing restraint over retaliation. But doesn't that just make him weak?" Tyler interjected without raising his hand. "I mean, if you let people walk all over you, they're just going to keep doing it, right?" The classroom dynamics shifted perceptibly. Other students began to lean forward, sensing that this wasn't really about Arthur Miller anymore. Jessica adjusted her phone angle slightly, ensuring she was capturing Sarah's facial expressions in high definition. Sarah felt the familiar weight of being surrounded by hostile forces, but this time the rules of engagement were maddeningly unclear. In combat, threats were identifiable and could be neutralized with appropriate force. Here, she was expected to maintain professional composure while being systematically dismantled by adversaries who understood they were protected by age, institutional politics, and social media amplification. "Literature often explores the gap between what we want to do and what we should do," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the growing tension. That's what makes these characters human and relatable. Marcus chose that moment to escalate. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with intentional loudness. You know what, Ms. Martinez? I think you're full of it. All this talk about strength and character, but you can't even control your own classroom. Maybe you should crawl back to wherever you came from before you embarrass yourself anymore. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Several students gasped at the direct challenge, while others pulled out their phones to capture what was clearly going to be a defining moment. Jessica's eyes lit up as she realized her content was about to go viral for all the right reasons. Sarah felt something shift inside her, like tectonic plates moving after years of pressure. The muscle memory of a dozen combat deployments whispered suggestions about how to handle insubordination, but she forced herself to remain still. The teenage spectators waited to see if their mild-mannered teacher would finally crack under the pressure. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "please take your seat." But Marcus had committed himself to a path with no retreat. His reputation among his peers depended on following through with whatever he had planned, and Sarah's calm response only seemed to infuriate him further. "Make me," he said, stepping closer to her desk. "Come on, Teach. Show us what you're really made of. Or are you too scared to do anything about it?" The challenge was unmistakable. In any other context, Sarah would have recognized it as a precursor to physical confrontation, the kind of verbal escalation that combat veterans learn to identify and respond to before situations became lethal. But this was a high school classroom, and the enemy was a child, and the weapons being used against her were social rather than physical. Tyler began a slow clap that was quickly picked up by several other students. The sound echoed off the walls like mockery set to rhythm, and Sarah realized that Marcus had orchestrated this moment with theatrical precision. This wasn't a spontaneous teenage rebellion, it was a planned humiliation designed to destroy her credibility and force her resignation. "I understand you're upset," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of authority that made several students sit up straighter. "But this behavior is unacceptable, and I need you to return to your seat immediately." "Or what?" Marcus demanded, now standing directly in front of her desk. "You'll write me up? Send me to the office?" "We both know nothing's going to happen. You're weak, and everyone knows it." The classroom had become a coliseum, with 23 teenage Romans waiting to see if the gladiator would fight back or simply be devoured. Jessica's phone captured every angle, every expression, every moment of what she was already mentally editing into her most viral content yet. Sarah stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. For a moment, Marcus seemed to recognize that something had changed in her posture, her presence, the way she carried herself. The mild-mannered teacher persona flickered like a candle in the wind, and beneath it, something much more dangerous began to show through. "Marcus," she said, and her voice carried undertones that made the hair on several students' arms stand up. "I'm going to give you one more chance to make the right choice here." But Marcus was too far committed to his performance, too invested in his image as the student who couldn't be intimidated by authority figures. He had painted himself into a corner where backing down would mean losing face, and teenage pride was often stronger than common sense. "I'm not scared of you," he said, though his voice carried a slight tremor that suggested otherwise. "You want to know what I think? I think you don't belong here. I think you should crawl out of here on your hands and knees where you belong, and maybe then you'll understand what real humiliation feels like." The words were designed to break her, to force her into either a breakdown or an overreaction that could be weaponized against her. What Marcus didn't understand was that he had just crossed a line that connected directly to training protocols. Sarah hadn't accessed in years rules of engagement that had been drilled into her during some of the most dangerous operations of her military career. The storm outside chose that moment to intensify, lightning illuminating the classroom windows. as thunder rumbled in the distance. The dramatic timing wasn't lost on anyone present, as if nature itself was providing a soundtrack for the confrontation that was about to reshape everything everyone thought they knew about their quiet English teacher. Sarah Martinez stood at a crossroads where her carefully constructed civilian identity was about to collide with reflexes and capabilities that belonged to a warrior, trained to handle threats far more dangerous than anything Lincoln High School had ever seen. The only question remaining was whether she could find a middle ground between total submission and complete tactical dominance, or if such a middle ground even existed in a situation that had been specifically designed to eliminate all reasonable options. The silence that followed Marcus's ultimatum stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Sarah Martinez stood motionless behind her desk, 23 pairs of eyes boring into her as smartphones captured every micro-expression. The rain against the windows had intensified into a full storm, creating a percussion section that seemed to match the thundering of her heart. In that crystalline moment of decision, Sarah's mind operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The civilian teacher calculated the professional consequences of any response, while the former Navy SEAL assessed tactical variables with lethal precision. 3 years of carefully constructed identity hung in the balance, threatened by a teenager who had unknowingly triggered protocols designed for far deadlier situations. Principal Janet Harrison chose that exact moment to appear in the doorway. Drawn by reports from other teachers about raised voices and unusual commotion in room 214, her timing was catastrophically perfect, arriving just as Marcus repeated his demand with increased volume. "I said crawl, teach. Show everyone what you really are." Harrison's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, then the kind of administrative panic that came from witnessing a situation spiraling beyond control. Her presence added a new dynamic to the confrontation, creating a three-way tension between student rebellion, teacher authority, and institutional damage control. "Mr. Wheeler," Harrison's voice cut through the room like a whip crack, "what exactly is going on here?" But Marcus was beyond the reach of administrative intervention. He had committed himself to a path that required total victory or complete destruction, and Sarah could see in his eyes the dangerous desperation of someone who had gone too far to retreat. His followers watched with the fascination of spectators at a car crash, their phones still recording every second. "I'm just having a conversation with Ms. Martinez about respect," Marcus said, his voice dripping with false innocence. "She was telling us about strength and character, and I thought maybe she could demonstrate what she meant." The psychological sophistication of his response impressed Sarah despite everything. Marcus had managed to frame his insubordination as an extension of her lesson, making her the aggressor if she responded with force and the victim if she submitted to his demands. It was a tactical maneuver that would have been impressive in a military context, if it weren't being deployed by a child against a woman trying to maintain her peaceful cover. Harrison stepped fully into the room, her administrative training kicking in as she attempted to de-escalate what was clearly a powder keg situation. "Everyone needs to calm down right now. Mr. Wheeler, return to your seat immediately. Ms. Martinez, I think we should." "No," Sarah said quietly, and something in her tone made everyone in the room freeze. "Principal Harrison, I appreciate your concern, but Marcus and I need to finish this conversation." The words carried undertones that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Jessica's camera captured the moment when Sarah's entire demeanor changed, the subtle transformation from prey to predator that happened so gradually it was almost imperceptible. Her posture straightened, her movements became more deliberate, and her eyes took on a focus that seemed to look through rather than at her opponents. Marcus felt the change but misinterpreted it as weakness disguised as bravado. "See? She can't even handle a simple conversation without calling for backup. Maybe if you really want to learn about character, you should start by learning what a backbone feels like." The insult was designed to provoke, but Sarah absorbed it like armor absorbing. A glancing blow. Years of psychological operations training had taught her to recognize manipulation tactics, and Marcus's entire strategy was textbook adolescent psychological warfare, effective against civilian targets, laughably transparent to someone with her background. "You want to know about character?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a new quality that made Tyler Brooks unconsciously lean back in his seat. "Character is what you do when you think no one is watching. It's the choices you make when you believe there are no consequences." She stepped out from behind her desk, moving with a fluidity that made Marcus's aggressive posturing look clumsy by comparison. The space between them became charged with potential energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. "You've been testing me for months," Sarah continued, each word measured and precise. "Pushing boundaries, looking for weakness, trying to make me break. You think you understand what strength looks like because you've learned to intimidate people who can't fight back." Harrison tried to intervene again, sensing that the situation was escalating beyond her ability to control. "Ms. Martinez, I really think we should take this to my office, but you've made one critical error in your assessment," Sarah continued, ignoring the principal's attempts at interruption. "You've assumed that my restraint comes from inability rather than choice." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Danny Castellano, with his military academy background, was the first to recognize the shift in Sarah's bearing. His face went pale as understanding dawned, and he began to calculate whether his association with Marcus was worth the consequences that seemed to be approaching like an avalanche. Marcus, however, remained oblivious to the changing dynamics. His teenage brain, flooded with adrenaline and the intoxicating power of public attention, pushed him past the point of rational assessment. "So what are you going to do about it? Are you going to make me crawl instead? Because I'm not afraid of some weak." The words died in his throat as Sarah moved. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, just a subtle shift in stance that transformed her from a mild-mannered teacher into something altogether more dangerous. Her feet found positions that provided optimal balance and mobility. Her hands moved to locations that could quickly transition to defensive or offensive capabilities. And her entire body language changed from passive to active. The transformation was so complete that several students didn't recognize her as the same person who had been teaching them about literature just minutes earlier. Jessica's phone captured the moment when the mask finally slipped, revealing glimpses of the warrior who had been hiding beneath 3 years of careful civilian camouflage. "You want me to crawl?" Sarah asked, and her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from leading people through life and death situations. "You think that breaking me down will prove something about your strength?" Marcus nodded eagerly, still not understanding the trap he had walked into. "Yeah, that's exactly what Then let's go outside," Sarah said simply. "Right now in the mud, in front of everyone. Let's see who ends up crawling." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down between medieval knights. The entire classroom held its collective breath as the implications sank in. Marcus had been demanding humiliation, but Sarah was offering something far more dangerous, a direct test of wills with stakes. Neither of them had fully calculated. Harrison's face went white as she realized that her quiet English teacher had just issued what amounted to a formal challenge to physical combat with a student. Every instinct of administrative self-preservation screamed warnings about liability, lawsuits, and career-ending scandals. "Ms. Martinez, you cannot be serious about." "I'm completely serious," Sarah replied, her gaze never leaving Marcus's face. "He wants to test strength and character? Fine, but we do it properly, with real consequences, not this playground nonsense." Marcus felt the weight of 23 pairs of eyes on him, his social media audience waiting for his response, his carefully cultivated reputation hanging in the balance. He had spent months building toward this moment, and backing down now would destroy everything he had worked to establish. But something in Sarah's eyes made Primitive survival instincts whisper warnings that his conscious mind refused to acknowledge. She wasn't looking at him like a teacher looking at a difficult student anymore. She was looking at him like a predator evaluating prey, calculating vulnerabilities, and planning responses to every possible move he might make. The storm outside reached its peak intensity just as the storm inside, room 214, prepared to break free of its institutional constraints. In less than 10 minutes, a group of Lincoln High School students would be standing in the mud behind the gymnasium, phones recording what they expected to be their teacher's ultimate humiliation. What they would witness instead would shatter every assumption they had ever made about strength, weakness, and the quiet woman who had spent 3 years hiding in plain sight among them. The migration from room 214 to the muddy field behind Lincoln High School's gymnasium took on the character of a medieval procession toward trial by combat. Word had spread through the building with the viral speed that only high school gossip could achieve, and students began materializing from every corner of the campus despite the torrential rain that had turned the October afternoon into a scene from a disaster movie. Sarah Martinez walked through the halls with the measured pace of someone who had made peace with inevitable consequences. Her cardigan had been replaced by a plain black pullover she kept in her desk for cold days, and she had tied her hair back in a way that suggested practicality over appearance. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The gentle English teacher was systematically stripping away everything that marked her as fragile. Behind her, Marcus Wheeler strutted with the confidence of someone who believed victory was assured. His entourage had grown during the journey, attracting followers who wanted to witness what they assumed would be the complete destruction of a teacher's authority. Tyler Brooks livestreamed their march to his Instagram followers, providing running commentary that painted Sarah as either delusional or having a complete breakdown. Jessica Hartley had positioned herself as the unofficial documentarian of the event, switching between multiple camera angles to ensure she captured every moment of what she was already mentally editing into her most viral content ever. Her follower count was climbing in real time as word spread across social media platforms, with viewers joining from other schools across the district to watch the drama unfold. Principal Harrison followed the procession like a shepherd trying to control a runaway flock, frantically making phone calls to the superintendent, the school board, and anyone else who might help her navigate the legal and professional nightmare that was unfolding under her watch. Her attempts to stop the confrontation had been ignored by both Sarah and Marcus, leaving her in the impossible position of either calling security to physically restrain her own teacher or allowing what could only be described as sanctioned violence to occur on school property. The gymnasium's rear exit opened onto a field that had been transformed by the storm into a landscape that belonged more to a military training exercise than a high school campus. Rain had turned the hard-packed earth into treacherous mud that sucked at shoes and made every step a battle for balance. The football team's practice area had become a quagmire that stretched toward a line of oak trees whose bare branches clawed at the gray sky. Danny Castellano, whose military academy experience had taught him to recognize dangerous situations before they became lethal, made one last attempt to extract his group from what his instincts told him was about to become a disaster. "Marcus, man, maybe we should think about this. She's not acting like any teacher I've ever seen." But Marcus was beyond the reach of rational advice. The adrenaline of public attention, the pressure of maintaining his reputation, and the intoxicating belief that he was about to achieve legendary status among his peers had combined to create a psychological state where retreat was impossible. "She's the one who challenged me," he replied, though his voice carried a slight tremor that suggested his subconscious was registering warnings his conscious mind refused to acknowledge. The crowd that had gathered represented a cross-section of Lincoln High's social ecosystem. Popular students mixed with outcasts, athletes stood beside drama club members, And even some faculty had joined the audience despite knowing they should be trying to stop what was happening. The universal appeal of witnessing authority challenged had temporarily suspended normal social barriers. Sarah surveyed the assembled crowd with the tactical assessment skills that had once kept her alive in hostile territories. She counted approximately 60 students, 4 teachers, and one increasingly panicked administrator. Multiple phones were recording from different angles, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved in high definition and disseminated across the internet within minutes. "Last chance," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind and rain. "Marcus, you can walk away right now, and we can pretend this was all just teenage drama that got out of hand." The offer was genuine, delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that special operations personnel extended to enemy combatants before hostilities commenced. It was also a final test to determine whether Marcus possessed enough survival instinct to recognize superior force when confronted with it. Marcus's response confirmed what Sarah had already suspected. He was operating on pride and peer pressure, rather than tactical intelligence. "I'm not backing down from you. You want to do this? Let's do this. But when you're face down in that mud, I want everyone to remember that you asked for it." The crowd pressed closer, forming a rough circle around the designated combat area. Jessica positioned herself for optimal filming angles while Tyler began taking bets on how long Sarah would last before breaking down completely. The atmosphere crackled with the electric anticipation that came from witnessing something unprecedented. A moment when the normal rules of adult authority and student submission were about to be tested in the most primitive way possible. Sarah removed her pullover, revealing a plain gray t-shirt that clung to a physique that suddenly looked much more athletic than anyone had ever noticed. Her movements as she folded the garment and set it aside carried an economy of motion that spoke of muscle memory developed through years of physical training. Several students in the crowd began to murmur nervously as they realized their quiet English teacher possessed a level of physical conditioning that didn't match her mild-mannered reputation. "Ground rules," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the wind and rain with military precision. "This ends when one of us yields or is unable to continue. No weapons, no assistance from friends, no interference from spectators. Everyone clear?" The formality of her approach caught Marcus off guard. He had expected emotional breakdown or desperate flailing, not the kind of systematic preparation that suggested actual combat experience. But surrounded by his audience and committed to his path, he nodded agreement while privately wondering why his hands had started shaking. Principal Harrison made one final attempt to restore sanity to the situation. "This is insane. I'm calling the police right now. Everyone needs to go back inside immediately before someone gets seriously hurt." But her authority had been superseded by the primitive social dynamics at play. The crowd ignored her completely, their attention focused on the two figures facing each other in the center of the muddy field. Sarah and Marcus stood approximately 10 feet apart, rain streaming down their faces, both aware that they had passed the point of no return. The moment stretched like a held breath as the storm reached its peak intensity. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark detail, creating a tableau that looked like something from an ancient battlefield rather than a modern educational institution. The assembled students fell silent, finally understanding that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally change their understanding of power, authority, and the woman they had dismissed as weak. Sarah Martinez, former Navy SEL lieutenant, settled into a combat stance that had been refined through years of training and tested in life or death situations across 3 different theaters of war. Across from her, Marcus Wheeler, an 18-year-old high school student who had confused intimidation with strength, prepared to learn the difference between bullying vulnerable targets and facing a predator who had been holding back for far too long. The reckoning that had been building for months was about to begin, and everyone present would remember this moment as the day They learned that sometimes the quiet ones are quiet for reasons that have nothing to do with weakness. First move came from Marcus Wheeler, driven by the desperate need to prove himself before his audience could witness any hint of hesitation. He lunged forward with the graceless aggression of someone whose fighting experience consisted primarily of intimidating smaller opponents and occasional scuffles with equally untrained teenagers. Sarah Martinez sidestepped the attack with fluid precision that made Marcus's charge look like slow motion. Her movement was economical, calculated, and absolutely devastating in its simplicity. As Marcus stumbled past her, thrown off balance by his own momentum and the treacherous footing, Sarah's hand shot out in a controlled strike that connected with a nerve cluster just below his shoulder blade. The technique was non-lethal but incapacitating, designed to temporarily disrupt muscle function without causing permanent damage. Marcus's right arm went instantly numb, and he crashed face first into the mud, with a splash that sent dirty water flying across the first row of spectators. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps of shock mixed with nervous laughter, as phones captured every angle of Marcus struggling to regain his footing with one functional arm. Jessica's camera zoomed in on his mud-caked face, the expression of confusion and growing fear perfectly preserved in high definition for her rapidly expanding audience. What the hell was that? Tyler Brooks shouted from the sidelines, his own livestream chat exploding with comments from viewers trying to process what they had just witnessed. The casual violence of the encounter had shattered everyone's expectations about how the confrontation would unfold. Sarah stood over Marcus with the relaxed posture of someone who had barely exerted herself. Rain streamed down her face, but her breathing remained steady and controlled. "That was a warning," she said calmly. "Get up and walk away, Marcus. This doesn't have to get worse." But Marcus's pride had been wounded along with his shoulder, and the humiliation of being dropped so easily in front of his peers triggered a desperate rage that overwhelmed his survival instincts. He struggled to his feet, mud coating half his body, and charged again with his functional arm, leading in a wild haymaker that telegraphed its trajectory from 3 feet away. Sarah caught his wrist mid-swing with a grip that felt like being clamped in a vice. Her fingers found pressure points that sent shooting pain up Marcus's arm, and she used his own momentum to redirect him into a controlled takedown that deposited him back in the mud with surgical precision. This time, she maintained her grip on his wrist, applying just enough pressure to make him gasp with pain. "I spent 4 years learning to neutralize threats that were trying to kill me," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly over the storm despite its conversational tone. "You're not a threat, Marcus. You're a child having a tantrum." The psychological impact of her words was amplified by the absolute control she demonstrated over his movement. Marcus found himself pinned in the mud, his face pressed into the cold earth, completely helpless despite being larger and supposedly stronger than his opponent. The reversal was so complete that several spectators began backing away, finally understanding that they were witnessing something far beyond normal teenage conflict. Danny Castellano, whose military academy training had taught him to recognize combat expertise, pulled out his phone to call 911. "This isn't a fight," he muttered to anyone within earshot. "This is a professional beating someone who doesn't know any better." Sarah released Marcus's wrist and stepped back, giving him space to stand while maintaining perfect defensive positioning. "Last warning," she said. "Walk away now, or I stop holding back." The offer of mercy was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that special operations personnel extended to defeated enemies. But Marcus was too far gone in humiliation and rage to recognize it as anything other than additional insult. He clambered to his feet, both arms now functioning but covered in mud that made gripping difficult. "You think you're so tough?" he snarled, spitting dirt from his mouth. "Let's see how tough you are." This time, his attack came in the form of a desperate tackle. hoping to use his size advantage to bring Sarah to the ground where he could rely on brute strength. It was the kind of strategy that might have worked against another untrained opponent, but Sarah had spent years training to counter precisely this type of assault. She dropped her center of gravity, absorbed the impact of his charge, and used a hip throw that sent Marcus flying through the air in a perfect arc before he crashed back to earth with a sound that made several spectators wince. The technique was textbook military combatives, executed with the kind of precision that came from hundreds of hours of practice against opponents who were actually trying to hurt her. Marcus lay motionless for several seconds, the wind knocked out of him, and his confidence completely shattered. When he finally managed to sit up, mud streaming from his hair and clothes, his eyes held the wild look of someone who had just realized he was completely outmatched. The crowd had fallen silent, except for the sound of rain and wind. Phones continued recording, but the earlier excitement had been replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that they were witnessing something that felt more like punishment than entertainment. The viral video they had expected to show their teacher's humiliation was instead documenting the systematic dismantling of a bully by someone who possessed skills they had never imagined. Principal Harrison stood frozen in horrified fascination, her administrative training completely inadequate for processing what she was witnessing. Her quiet English teacher had just demonstrated combat capabilities that belonged in military training videos, not high school disciplinary incidents. The legal implications alone were staggering, but she found herself unable to look away from the demonstration of controlled violence unfolding before her. Sarah remained in position, her stance suggesting readiness for whatever came next, while her expression showed nothing more than professional focus. She wasn't enjoying the violence, wasn't drawing satisfaction from Marcus's humiliation. She was simply applying the appropriate level of force necessary to neutralize a threat that had refused multiple opportunities to withdraw. "Are we done here?" she asked, her voice carrying over the storm with the kind of authority that made everyone present understand they were in the presence of someone who had commanded respect in much more dangerous situations than a high school confrontation. Marcus tried to stand, slipped in the mud, and fell again. His earlier swagger had been completely erased, replaced by the shaking hands and rapid breathing of someone experiencing genuine fear for the first time in his life. The transformation from aggressor to victim was so complete that even his most loyal followers began to feel sympathy for him. Tyler Brooks, whose live stream had been gaining viewers throughout the confrontation, found himself struggling to provide commentary for what he was witnessing. "I don't know what's happening," he admitted to his audience. "This isn't what we expected at all." Jessica's social media empire was built on her ability to read and manipulate social situations, but she found herself completely unprepared for content that challenged every assumption her audience held about power dynamics and authority. Her camera continued recording, but her usual confident commentary had been replaced by stunned silence. Sarah took a step forward, and Marcus instinctively scrambled backward, his fight-or-flight response firmly locked on flight, despite the audience watching his retreat. The psychological warfare he had deployed against her for months had been turned back on him with interest, and he was discovering that being the target of systematic intimidation was far different from being the perpetrator. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the storm with military precision. "You're going to get up, walk back to that building, and think very carefully about whether you want to continue testing people you don't understand." The words carried implications that went far beyond the immediate confrontation, suggesting consequences that Marcus's teenage imagination was only beginning to calculate. For the first time in months, he was experiencing the helplessness and fear that he had been inflicting on others, and the lesson was being delivered with a thoroughness that would reshape his understanding of strength and weakness forever. Silence that followed Sarah's ultimatum stretched across the muddy field like the calm after an explosion. Marcus Wheeler sat in the mud, his earlier bravado completely evaporated, staring up at the woman who had just redefined his understanding of power. The rain continued to fall, washing streaks of dirt from his face and revealing the pale shock. Beneath, "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible over the storm. "I'm so sorry." The apology carried the weight of genuine terror, the kind of bone-deep realization that came from understanding how badly he had miscalculated the situation. Marcus had spent months believing he was hunting a sheep, only to discover he had been provoking a wolf who had been showing remarkable restraint. Sarah studied his face for several seconds, reading the sincerity in his expression with the same tactical assessment skills she had once used to evaluate the trustworthiness of foreign contacts in hostile territories. Satisfied that his submission was genuine, she extended her hand to help him to his feet. The gesture of mercy after such overwhelming dominance created a psychological impact that rippled through the assembled crowd. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then accepted her assistance, allowing her to pull him upright with strength that reminded everyone present of the physical capability she had kept hidden for 3 years. "You're not a bad kid, Marcus," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying only to him despite the dozens of phones still recording. "You're just confused about what strength actually means. Real power isn't about making others feel small, it's about lifting them up." The words hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have. Tears mixed with rainwater on his face as the full weight of his behavior over the past months crashed down on him. He had been so focused on establishing dominance that he had never considered the possibility that true authority came from service rather than intimidation. Tyler Brooks, still live-streaming to his rapidly growing audience, found himself struggling to process what he was witnessing. The narrative he had expected to document a weak teacher's humiliation had been completely inverted. Instead, his viewers were seeing a masterclass in controlled force and professional restraint that challenged every assumption about power dynamics in educational settings. "Chat's going crazy," Tyler muttered to himself, scrolling through comments that ranged from shock to admiration to demands for more information about Sarah's background. The video was already being shared across multiple platforms, with engagement numbers climbing toward viral territory for all the wrong reasons from his original perspective. Jessica Hartley faced a similar crisis of narrative. Her carefully constructed social media empire was built on identifying and exploiting weakness. But Sarah had demonstrated a kind of strength that rendered Jessica's tactics obsolete. The content she had captured was undeniably compelling, but it painted her as complicit in the systematic harassment of someone who had been showing remarkable patience rather than weakness. Her phone buzzed with notifications as her follower count continued climbing, but for the first time in her social media career, Jessica felt sick about the attention she was receiving. The comments were no longer celebrating her content creation skills. They were questioning her judgment and condemning her role in the confrontation. Principal Harrison finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper that barely carried over the storm. "Ms. Martinez, we need to discuss what just happened here. There are procedures, policies, legal considerations. There will be a full report on my desk by Monday morning," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off Marcus. "Every detail, every witness statement, every video angle. I'm sure the school board will want a complete investigation." The promise of documentation sent a chill through the assembled crowd that had nothing to do with the rain. Students began to realize that their phones had captured evidence of their own participation in what could be classified as harassment, cyberbullying, and incitement to violence. The viral content they had been eager to create might become exhibits in disciplinary hearings or legal proceedings. Danny Castellano, whose military academy experience had taught him to recognize when situations required damage control, began quietly encouraging his classmates to delete their recordings. "This isn't going to end well for any of us," he warned. "We need to think about what we've been part of here." But the digital genie was already out of the bottle. Screenshots and clips had been shared across multiple platforms, with users adding commentary that ranged from celebration of Sarah's skills to condemnation of the student's behavior. Hashtag Lincoln High Bullies began trending on local social media, while hashtag Navy SEAL Teacher started gaining traction among accounts that specialized in military content. Sarah's carefully constructed civilian identity was disintegrating in real time. 3 years of peaceful anonymity destroyed by 60 seconds of combat footage. The quiet English teacher persona she had cultivated was being replaced by viral videos that showcased capabilities she had hoped never to reveal in a civilian context. The irony wasn't lost on her that Marcus's campaign to destroy her reputation had ultimately exposed truths that would make her more famous than she had ever wanted to be. Military news blogs were already reaching out to contacts at Naval Special Warfare Command, trying to confirm details about a female SEAL who had apparently become a high school teacher in Oregon. As the crowd began to disperse, students returning to the building in small groups while frantically checking their phones and social media accounts, Sarah found herself alone with Marcus in the muddy field. The rain had begun to ease, but both of them were soaked through and covered in mud that would serve as physical evidence of their confrontation for days to come. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, his voice small and uncertain. The aggressive teenager who had demanded she crawl in the mud had been replaced by a frightened young man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. Sarah considered the question while surveying the damage to both the field and her carefully maintained cover. "Now you learn," she said simply. "You learn that actions have consequences, that words have power, and that the people you think are weak might be the strongest ones in the room." She started walking toward the gymnasium, then paused and looked back at him. "And Marcus, you learn to use whatever strength you have to protect people who can't protect themselves. That's what real warriors do." The words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, lessons learned through years of service in situations where the difference between predator and protector could mean the difference between life and death. Marcus nodded silently, understanding that he had been given something far more valuable than the humiliation he had sought to inflict. As Sarah Martinez walked back toward Lincoln High School, her clothes muddy and her secret exposed, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be less than she was. The gentle English teacher would return to her classroom on Monday morning, but she would never again have to hide the steel beneath her compassion. Behind her, Marcus Wheeler sat alone in the mud, surrounded by the wreckage of his former self-image, and faced with the opportunity to build something better from the ruins. The rain continued to fall, washing away the physical evidence of their confrontation, while leaving psychological scars that would serve as permanent reminders of the day he learned the difference between bullying and strength. The videos would continue circulating, the investigation would proceed, and Lincoln High School would never be quite the same. But sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers, and sometimes the strongest people were the ones who chose kindness until kindness was no longer an option. In the end, Sarah Martinez had taught her most important lesson not through literature or discussion, but through demonstration. That true strength lay not in the ability to hurt others, but in the wisdom to know when restraint served a greater purpose than force. And sometimes, very rarely, that purpose required showing exactly what restraint had been holding back all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.